Hey, das ist Bia for 64K and welcome to another video game documentary, this time for Synapse Software.
The complete history of Synapse Software, 1981 to 1985.
Okay, so let's get the ball rolling and check out the brief origins of the company. Synapse Software Corporation, or Synsoft as they were known in the UK, were an American computer game developer founded in 1981. They worked primarily on Atari 8-bit computer games and applications, as well as Commodore 64 games. They were well known in the early years for their excellent arcade-style games, which were mostly variations on popular arcade games, but later built up a really good reputation for fantastic original releases, as well as branching out into the text-adventure genre near the end. Synapse Software was founded by Ihor Wolosenko and Ken Grant in 1981 in California. Ihor Wolosenko was born in Austria of Ukrainian parents who moved to the US after World War II and settled in New York. In his early years, Ihor ran a very successful photography business, but yearned for a change of scenery and weather, and decided to move to California to pursue the American dream. Out there, he discovered computers and fell in love with them. He was a big fan of arcade games as well, and decided his first computer was going to be an Atari 800 system, based entirely on the fact that you could play Star Raiders on it. He was also fascinated as to how they worked and immersed himself in the manuals and managed to teach himself the Assemble editor. He slowly started making friends in the Atari community, and through a mutual friend in the Atari circle, he met Ken Grant. Ken at the time was working at the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco, where he was in charge of data processing. Ken called Ihor up one day and they met at Ken's house, where he showed him some of his programs that he had written. Ken basically explained that he didn't have the time to finish them properly, so Ihor agreed to help out, and they decided to form a company to distribute and sell the software once it was complete. The software in question was File Manager 800. Through the Atari community, they also met a guy called Rob Ray, and he had written a game called Dodge Racer, which was a clone of Sega's head-on arcade game, and they struck up a deal with him to release it at the same time as File Manager. They also met Mark Potter, who had written a Defender-style clone game which was ready as well. All this leads to 1981, where Synapse was finally ready to start releasing software to the computer-hungry masses. So this is the part of the show where I go through all the games that Synapse made. I'll also be giving you a little bit of a brief history on what was happening at the company each year as we go through it. And with that, let's get this thing started.
1981 saw the release of 2 games.
1981 was Synapse's first plunge into the software market, and it worked out quite well. The 2 games in question, although clones of popular arcade games, had enough variations to make consumers take notice. First up is Protector by Mark Potter, which as you can see is a Defender-style clone, which ran quite well on Atari 8-bit and was later ported to the VIC-20 in 1983. Your goal is to save the citizens and fly them to safety before the volcano erupts, as well as protect them from alien invaders. Over the next year and a half, Mark would create another 4 more games for Synapse. Also that year saw the release of Dodge Racer by Rob Ray, which, like Protector, was a variation on Sega's head-on arcade game from 1979, which is pretty much seen as the prototype for Namco's Pac-Man that came out a year later. Gameplay involves collecting dots while avoiding crashes with your opponent. All in all, a pretty good start. Here's what Ihor had to say about developing games in those early days.
So I had ideas for what kind of game action I would like to see, what kind of challenges I would like to see. I mean, they were just dynamic puzzles that interested me. So started designing other games, Chicken and I forgot what else was in that early batch. I think Nautilus, and certainly inspired by many of the things that I saw around me in coin-op, and thought were interesting exercises, and ultimately thinking about what it was about the games that was so compelling. I mean, what was the addictive quality?
1982 saw the release of 10 games.
1982 was a great year not only in terms of the amount of releases, but also for the company to start building a reputation for making great original games. There were still a few clones, but the originals were very well received, and a lot of gaming classics were born. First up was Chicken, Mark Potter's second game, which was inspired by the 1978 arcade game Avalanche. Your goal is to catch the eggs the fox is throwing down and save them. It's simple and could maybe be considered as a really early Twitch game, something you just have to try again as soon as you get the game over. 1982 also saw them branching out, not only supporting the Atari 8-bit family, but also the newly released Commodore 64, which they supported heavily. Most of those games made it to Europe as well, through US Gold releasing them under the Synapse label. And now let's check out Potter's next game, Protector 2, which was essentially a remix of the first game, but just a whole lot better. Rescue citizens from the volcano and blast aliens. It's way more action orientated, but quite a fun game overall. Mark Potter's third and last game for 1982 was Nautilus, an arcade action game where you get to control either a submarine or a destroyer, and is noted as being the first game to incorporate a split-screen two-player mode, where both people could play at the same time. The game reviewed really well and received a certificate of merit for the most innovative computer game of 1982 from the Archie Awards. In Mark's own words, "I loved working with Ihor at Synapse. In 1 year I developed 5 programs for Synapse: Protector, Protector 2, Chicken, Nautilus, and Shadow World, with a combined sales of 93,000 copies. Next is Picnic Paranoia, the first game by Russ Siegel, who later did New York City also for Synapse that we'll have a look at later. It was another Twitch-style arcade game where you were defending your picnic against ants and spiders and making sure to defend your food at all costs. It sported pretty good graphics and sound for a 1982 game. Next was Claim Jumper, a fun little two-player game where racing against each other to find gold, trade it, and bank the cash, all the while avoiding natural elements like snakes and tumbleweed. An issue of Compute magazine from 1983 described it as fascinating and hectic. Next was Slime, a game that had been in development at Synapse for a while until the original programmer dropped out. Ihor wanted to finish the game, and in came Steve Hales, who was already working on a game called Fort Apocalypse, but Ihor asked him to finish Slime as it was a concept by Ihor himself, and the game was basically a variation on Atari's Missile Command. You had to protect your ship from the rain of slime, while also defending yourself from alien saucer attacks. Next was Survivor, a top-down scrolling shoot-'em-up where you had to destroy huge alien fortresses. It also featured a two-player option where one player controlled the ship while the other controlled the guns, which was pretty innovative as far as games go. And this title always reminds me of 1988's Hunter's Moon by Martin Walker. And I'm kind of curious if he ever played this and was maybe inspired by some of the gameplay elements. Necromancer was next by designer Bill Williams, who programmed 2 games for Synapse, and went on to an impressive career working on many Amiga games, such as Mindwalker and Sinbad and the Throne of the Falcon. The game is pretty unique and hard to describe, but as a wizard you try to raise an army of trees to help you attack a necromancer who is attempting to take over the graveyard. It's part shoot-'em-up action puzzle with some light platform style gameplay. It's just a lot of fun to play and is very unique. Creative Computing magazine claimed it's one of the strangest yet imaginative games I've ever played. Definitely worth checking out. Next was Shamus, another great action game taking inspiration from the arcade game, this time Berserk. It's a fast-paced and fun game and was written by William Matega, who went on to do a bunch of other great games for the company that we'll see later. Ihor cites this game as the one where people really started to take notice in the company and realized they designed some really quality games. Softline magazine in 1983 said, "To know it is to love it. Play it constantly and not get enough of it." Next was the first Synapse Software game I ever played, which was Fort Apocalypse by Steve Hales, his second game for the company. Helicopters in the 80s were considered really cool, and Fort Apocalypse was naturally inspired by the helicopter flick Blue Thunder, which influenced the TV show Airwolf, and hence, helicopters were cool in the 80s. And now back to the game, which was a shoot-'em-up exploration game, I guess? It's kind of its own thing, with a bit of Activision's Hero with a bit of Broderbund's Choplifter, where you have to infiltrate this fort and rescue a bunch of hostages, and then blow up the fort's main reactor and escape. Yeah, it sounds simple, but yeah, it's definitely not. Although the game is made up essentially of 2 massive sections, it requires meticulous skill in flying to make it all the way to the end. Not only are you dealing with tanks, other helicopters, but also all manner of traps that are trying to blow you up, and your dwindling fuel tank as well. Fortunately, there are landing pads throughout the game which act as checkpoints and avoid some mindless backtracking, as well as this extremely useful radar system at the top of the screen where you can see incoming enemies and all the terrain ahead. It was pretty innovative for the time and reminds me a lot of the one in Defender. Gameplay wise, it controls really well with tight controls that work perfectly. The graphics are simple, as most of them were in the C64 early days, but are still pretty good, and there's no music, just sound effects, and there again, they are simple and complement the action perfectly. There's also a multitude of difficulty settings, so do not be discouraged. With practice, this game is a joy to play, and as you get further and further down the base, you get this awesome sense of exploration and what's around the next corner. It's a really fantastic early Synapse C64 release, and if you've never played it, you should definitely give it a try. Port Apocalypse ended up selling over 75,000 copies on the Atari 800 and well over that for the Commodore 64 version, and is probably much more well known as a C64 game these days.
1983 saw the release of 9 games.
By 1983, Synapse was a thriving company, and they moved several times to bigger and better locations. Ihor himself was way more interested in helping the designers and developer games, and was less interested in the day-to-day business activities. So let's jump into the first game, which was Rainbow Walker by Steve Coleman, who would go on to make my personal favorite Synapse game. But more on that later. Rainbow Walker was pretty unique and required you to change the dull grey rainbow into a colourful, vibrant one by jumping on the squares, all the while being attacked from all angles. Pretty impressive graphics for the time, with unique gameplay that made it surprisingly cool to play. A review from Antic magazine stated, Rainbow Walker, Synapse Software's latest arcade game, joins the company's previous games as one of the most imaginative, graphically stimulated and playable games on the market. Next was another unique game from Bill Williams of Necromancer fame, titled Alley Cat, in which you control a cat trying to make it to reach his girlfriend Felicia, all the while going through people's deadly houses and alleys to get there. It's a really well-made game that jumps between gameplay styles frantically in a really fast-paced arcade style that Synapse were known for. This one, for whatever reason, stayed only on the Atari and IBM PC systems and didn't get a C64 port, unfortunately. Next is another classic Synapse game I played to death and was so addicted to, namely Blue Max by Bob Poland. In the game, you fly a World War I Sopwith Camel and attempt to take down enemy planes and bomb factories, gun emplacements, and pretty much everything else over the enemy line. I really loved the 3/4 viewpoint, which gave the game a sense of depth. Bear in mind, games at least in 1983 didn't do much of that and stuck mostly to 2D endeavors. Ahoy magazine said Bob Poland has done an exceptional job. This is one game that is really addictive. Next was William Mattega's second game, Shamus Case 2, the sequel to 1982 Shamus. Gameplay wise, it is completely different. Besides the main character, you got a platform style, maze, sequences, and even Arkanoid style gameplay, which all sounds like it really shouldn't work together, but it all flows so well for a very original experience. I enjoyed this one much more than the original. The frantic gameplay switches just made it way more fun for me. Creative Computing said, Shamus Case 2 has some clever design and a hectic pace of its namesake in a completely new setting. Next is Drelves, a fast-paced maze puzzle game by Kelly Jones. I'm not usually a fan of this style of game, but Drelves is pure arcade-style addictiveness at its best. It moves at a fast pace and is almost strategy-like in its gameplay. Antic magazine said, great graphics and sound, the real winner. Next, out of all the Synapse catalog, this is my favorite of them all, which is Pharaohs Curse by Steve Coleman, who also did Rainbow Walker. The game is a platform-style action game where the goal is to collect all 16 treasures from the Egyptian tomb, Indiana Jones style. Of course, the place is filled with traps, mummies, bats, and more. The gameplay works really well, and again, it's fast-paced just like all Synapse games, which really gets your adrenaline going. This was the closest thing to a cool Indiana Jones style game I could play at the time, which just made me want to play it twice as much. Antic said Pharaoh's Curse will appeal to all computerists and gamesters. It's another winner from Synapse. Next is Mike Potter's last game for Synapse, which was Shadow World, which was only released on the Atari 8-bit series of computers. This is another shoot-'em-up style game where you have to defend Earth from an alien invasion. It's much more of an action game compared to Potter's earlier Protector series, but it's a great blast nonetheless. Potter was quoted as saying that this was his favorite game out of his entire Synapse run. Next was another game by William Matega called Zeppelin, and was an arcade-style action exploration game. It's quite a weird game and involves you flying a Zeppelin through these underground caves, picking up keys to open gates and blasting other Zeppelins. It's slow-paced but quite interesting if you know what you're doing. And the last game from 1983 was Countdown, where you had to infiltrate an enemy missile facility and disarm the rockets that were aimed at your country. It's decent without being anything spectacular and was never released as a solo game, but rather bundled with Rainbow Walker as a double pack.
1984 saw the release of 16 games.
By 1984, Synapse were the biggest third-party provider for Atari 8-bit games, but 65% of their actual sales came from Commodore 64 games. Things were still looking pretty good, but trouble was on the horizon. First up is Bob Poland's follow-up to Blue Max, namely Blue Max 2001. This time you drive a futuristic hovercraft and do pretty much the same thing as in Blue Max, except it's just not that much fun, and is ultimately a pretty dismal sequel in all senses. Zap 64 magazine said it's one of the most disappointing sequels of all time, which pretty much sums it up in a nutshell. Next was another Steve Hale's game, this one exclusively for the Atari 8-bit line, called Dimension X, a first-person style vehicle combat game similar to Atari's Battlezone. I think they were trying to replicate in some way one of Ehor's favorite games, Star Raiders, but it just doesn't work, and the game is just too repetitious to be any fun. And besides that, it got generally poor reviews across the board, which led them to cancel the C64 version. Fortunately, they kinda made up for it by publishing a game by NovaGen called Encounter, which was pretty much the same game, just done way better and a lot more fun to play. It had a much faster pace and way better graphics. The game was released independently by NovaGen in the UK. I first played this at a friend's house and was totally jealous and I wanted it for myself. Paul Wokes, the programmer, went on to make the awesome C64 game Mercenary. Next was Doug Boy, where he had to rescue the president by making it through enemy lines. I remember playing this in my local computer shop, Computer Connections, in about 1985, and then looking over at the other monitor and seeing Commando on display. So naturally I put down Doug Boy and bought Commando, and it was just as well. This game may have its fans, but I just found it to be too fiddly and annoying. It's strange though that it actually got a Famicom port in 1985 as well. Next was New York City by Russ Siegel, who had already done Picnic Paranoia in 1982. It was part of a double pack with Electrician, which were both bundled together and never released separately in English formats. First, let's look at New York City, which is a strange game to figure out. Basically, you just have to survive in New York for 1 week, driving cars, trying not to get run over, hospital visits, searching for food to keep yourself alive. It's pretty weird. I never really got into it. The other game, however, Electrician, is simple but fun. Basically, you have to reinstall electrical wire in apartment buildings. I know it sounds lame, but it's actually quite fun. And after each building is complete, you have to navigate the sewers to get to the next one. David Bunch, the designer of the game, went on to co-design Skate or Die at Electronic Arts. Next was Quasimodo, a game that always reminded me of another C64 game called Orc Attack, even though they were both released in 1984. The game involves you defending your tower from attackers as well as platform-style levels, and a lot of swinging action similar to Ocean's Hunchback game. It's good and it's well worth a look. Next is Air Support, a very unique action RTS style game that has you flying a helicopter and bombing and taking out targets, therefore giving your troops an advantage in the battle below. It's fast and crazy, and has a lot of strategy even though it looks like a shoot 'em up. Richard Carr, the designer, also did the earlier game, Survivor. Next is probably my third favorite of the games, called Sentinel, which is Synapse's attempt again to make Star Raiders. This time though, they do a marvelous job at it, and it's a fun arcade style shoot 'em up where you have to defend your star bases from alien attacks. It's really well made with good sprite-based 3D style graphics, and it all moves at a cracking pace as usual. Paul Norman of Cosmi fame also did the music for this one. It's an excellent game and a must play. Next is Slamball, Synapse's attempt at a pinball pinball game, which they pull off quite well. It's no classic, but it plays well enough, and I love the huge table which scrolls with the ball. The graphics and sound are okay, but it still manages to be enjoyable, and that's one of the biggest pluses for a game, at least for me. Zap64 though rated it 96% overall, which I think is a bit insane. It's good, but Synapse have much better stuff for you to check out first. Next is Warrior of Zapar, a weird arena-based combat game that me and my next door neighbor used to jam out to in 2-player versus mode. It's a pretty odd game and almost feels like a super retro version of the Dreamcast game Power Stone. It's okay as a single player game, but it's way better if you play it in versus mode. Next was the only official arcade conversion they ever did, which is crazy because they were so good at cloning popular arcade games, although giving them their own spins. But in 1984 they got the rights to convert Zaxxon to the C64 based on the excellent Sega arcade game. It's an isometric shoot 'em up where you fly through enemy bases, blasting the hell out of everything. The isometric viewpoint works exceptionally well for such an old game, and the perspective and depth is done perfectly. It's great fun, and they did an awesome job of this conversion. It's a pity they never got to do any others. At this point, Synapse decided that the text adventure genre was going to be the games of the future, as well as making a bunch of software applications in the Synfile series. Both of these endeavors led to the beginning of the end. It partly boiled down to bad luck, being that they had made a deal with Atari to produce a whole line of software application programs, and it shipped 40,000 units complete. Little did they know that Jack Tramiel, the founder of Commodore, had just bought Atari and refused to pay Synapse for everything they had shipped. This sent the company into a spiral financially, where they had no choice and were bought out by Broderbund. The good thing was that Broderbund wanted to keep the Synapse label alive, so the last slew of games stumbled out of the gates. The aforementioned text adventure games were released, with Mindwheel being the most acclaimed of the bunch. They reviewed pretty well for these types of games, but the sales weren't good, and that made Broderbund very nervous. They also made a game called Viper for the Mindset computer, which was a flash-in-the-pan PC that was well regarded, but it only lasted just over a year before being discontinued.
1985 saw the release of one game.
In 1985, Synapse released their last game through Broderbund, namely Lode Runner's Rescue, which is part of Broderbund's Lode Runner series they started back in 1983. This game honestly has almost nothing that series is known for. The isometric viewpoint makes it really hard to navigate, and it almost feels like Synapse had a game that they hadn't published yet, and being part of Broderbund allowed them to use the name Lode Runner. This is obviously just my pure speculation, but it's a really annoying game to play, and definitely not a Lode Runner game I'd recommend you try. At this point, the writing was already on the wall. With the massive failure of the text adventure series, this led Broderbund to shut down the label for good. And here's what Ihor had to say about the end of Synapse.
One of the reasons that Synapse, went the way of the dodo is really because of Atari. Atari's, specifically because of Atari and the Tramielized Atari and all of the money that they owed us and all of that kind of stuff. But I think ultimately that when we stopped was the ascent of Nintendo and Sega and all the rest of the stuff, and people just went to those machines that had better graphics. They were basically coin-op games that were then available, not only that, but coin-op plus that were available to people, which NTSC connections to TVs just weren't able to deliver.
So that ended Synapse's short but impressive run as a third-party game developer. So you're probably wondering whatever happened to some of the programmers and movers and shakers at Synapse. Bill Williams of Necromancer and Alley Cat fame continued on in the industry, working on some really great Amiga gems like Sinbad and the Throne of the Falcon and Knights of the Crystallion. He also did a few console games in the early 90s like Bart's Nightmare for the Super Nintendo, but constant company meddling and stress made him leave the industry. Unfortunately, he died in 1998 over complications with his cystic fibrosis disorder. Mark Potter of Protector and Nautilus fame went on to create many software programs for computers from the mid-80s to about 1993. He also created an early application for eBay in 1999, which was very popular, called Auction Tamer, and as of 2016, he was still updating it. William Matega of Shamus and Zeppelin fame became Catherine Matega, and she continued on in the industry, forging an impressive resume, including working on a whole slew of acclaimed Dungeons & Dragons games for SSR, like Neverwinter Nights and Gateway to a Savage Frontier. Later on, she formed her own company, Jungle Vision, which ported many games to the Nintendo 3DS and PC formats, and currently works at Big Fish Games. Steve Hales of Ford Apocalypse and Dimension X fame worked on tons of games in the industry, programming the Amiga versions of Maniac Mansion and Zack McCracken, and on sound duties for Blackthorn and Out of This World, amongst many others. Check out his company eaglelabs.com for more info on his current endeavors. As for Bob Poland, the designer of BlueMax, he ended up releasing the assembly language source code for BlueMax publicly in 2016 for everybody to take a gander at. And as for the man himself, Ihor Wolosenko, he went on to form other smaller software companies as well. He also worked at Maxis in the early 90s, working on various Sims games. He currently lives in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and enjoys spending his time songwriting and building acoustic guitars. And here he is, in his own words, summing up the games and times at Synapse.
It was an interesting time, and certainly in the same way that, that particular tunes dominate your life, and you sort of look at your progression through life, with the kinds of music that you listen to and the artists, and the kind of angst that they spoke to at that particular developmental stage in your life. Same thing with the games. I mean, they are very specific in the kinds of memories that they encode and the kinds of times that they encode, both good and bad. But not only do you think about the games, but you think about the excitement of that time. You think about, how old you were, your friends at that time, how they affected you, what kinds of doors they opened for you or closed, or whatever it was. And so I think that kind of cultural encoding and being able to be part of that in some small way is really neat.
And thanks for joining me, Bassish B at 64K. If you enjoyed this little documentary, check out my YouTube channel. I've got quite a few others, you might enjoy them as well. And on that note, if you can like and subscribe, they'll be greatly appreciated, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!